version of the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast brought to you by Arihanta Institute. My name is Jonathan Dickstein. I'm a professor of Jain and Vegan Studies at Arihanta Institute and also the lead organizer for our Vegan Studies initiative. I have also been the host for a few of these live versions of our ongoing podcast, the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, that you can find via our website or normal streaming venues. But a few times we do these special ones in which we incorporate video and we also have some time for Q&A from the audience. So at the end of our talk, maybe go for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, we'll voice some of the questions that are in the Q&A. So I certainly encourage you all out there to leave your questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So today's podcast is with Sahana Mehta, Anjli Shah, and Mohit Mookim on the topic of radical Jainism. And this is really about, I'll get into this topic of radical Jainism or radical anything at all, but this is really a topic about Jainism across generations and Jainism across geography, and trying to understand how Jainism, in its engaged sense, as we stress at Arihanta, applies to contemporary problems and issues in 2025, obviously not just in India, but in the European diaspora, the North American diaspora, and elsewhere. And, when I have given podcasts, hosted podcast episodes in the Vegan Studies kind of program, I often ask guests how they got radicalized for animals. And a lot of people in vegan movement or animal movement will say there's nothing radical about compassion. There's nothing like radical about that stance. And while that may be true in a political sense, right, there's a way in which a common feature of all radical politics or political forms is the stance that there needs to be some fundamental change to the status quo, right? And let's say if I'm using it in a neutral sense. So I guess that's kind of where I'm coming at in this question of radical Jainism. Is there a sense in which there's a status quo that needs to be changed or needs to be rethought or reconsidered? So I'll open it up kind of on that topic. So I titled the podcast Radical Jainism, and I'm kind of curious, maybe for the three of you, any first impressions, like, do these terms go together? What's the kind of initial response? And is there a such thing as a radical Jainism? Maybe I'll start off with Sahana, if that's okay.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. So I am so excited to be here and talk about this concept and start to explore what it means to pursue a radical Jainism. And I think that in my mind, the practice of the values of Jainism can be considered radical in the current conditions that we live under. So in the conditions that are so deeply focused on wealth hoarding, wealth accumulation, greed, so on and so forth, the truths or principles of Jainism are radical, whether that is about non-stealing, non-greed, maintaining multiple viewpoints, pursuing nonviolence. All of that is radical under the conditions that we exist in America and under capitalism. And so I believe that there is radical Jainism, and as Jains in the diaspora, that's something for us to continue to explore and cultivate. That's my first thought.
No, that's great. And probably the audience is kind of curious about everyone here, and you can access all the bios through the event page. And we're going to get to some of the work that our guests are doing as we move on. But I kind of wanted us to dive in right away. So I don't know, Mo, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. And again, thank you for hosting us, Jonathan, and so happy to be here. My family was like, "Wait, you're on a podcast about radical?" And then I sent them the link, and they're like, "Oh my God, we have to tell our friends." So, yes, it's an honor to be here, and yeah, I think I kind of chuckled at myself with the title Radical Jainism, mostly because I feel like sometimes using the word radical makes it sound like it's not something you should be. And just the idea that like my approach to Jainism is, I mean, it's very much informed by how my dad taught me about what Jain values are and what they mean, and the core ones being nonviolence, non-materialism, and non-egoism. And he just kind of like would repeat those like throughout my life. And I feel like none of those feel radical to me, taken at their face. And I think the more I sat with what those values mean to me, it was clear that they were like, I'm imagining what those values meant 2,500 years ago, um, before European colonization had basically dominated the whole world. And the European systems of extraction from the land at all costs, from like especially the sort of exploitation of land and ecosystems and of people being at the kind of being one of the core logics of our economic system and our society that we live in. I feel like um, yeah, that's the way in which sometimes to be Jane did start to feel more and more radical, where actually in order to really practice nonviolence and compassion for all beings, we have to really question, like, okay, we get a job, we get an income from a job and we put it in a bank account, and then the bank loans that money to a fossil fuel pipeline that builds a new extraction project with it. And so it's not just like, oh, like I'm just trying to exist in a non-violent way and I'm not harming anyone and I put my money in a bank account. And then once you look behind the curtains of what how all of these institutions operate, and sometimes maybe they'll fund a healthcare facility with your money or give a loan to that facility, but other times they'll give a loan to a weapons company. And so how do you engage in with money and in with jobs and with each other in nonviolent and like truly non-materialistic, non-egoistic ways, has definitely been a big through line of my life and work.
And Anjali?
Yeah, thanks so much for this. I'm really excited for this conversation, and I've like loved all the conversations we've had so far. So excited for this one. I resonate a lot with what Sahana and Mo just shared. I think when I was thinking about this, I mean, I also kind of chuckled. I think my idea of like what's radical comes from learning about social movements where people have come together in mass to say things aren't right and to demand better and then to build better. And that's come from like Black liberation movements or the Chicano movement here in LA or Indigenous land back movements. And so the way that I've learned about what it means to be radical has come from that lineage. And I think my values around Jainism have come from a really different history. And so I think I'm very much, frankly, actively in this inquiry of like, can you have radical Jainism? But I think when I think of radical Jainism, I think I kind of, in my head, I flipped it of not radical Jainism, but how do you apply Jainism radically? And as Sahana and Mo were talking about, especially in today's age, and kind of drawing from the things that I've learned from that other lineage is the two kind of quotes that stuck out to me were, so Angela Davis, who is an activist that folks are probably familiar with, who's advocated for prison. She's a big, big person in the Black liberation movement, obviously, and in prison abolition. And she says that radical simply means grasping things at the root. And I think that there is, in today's world, when I think about Jainism, like what does it mean to radically apply nonviolence and non-attachment as lay people who are living in community? That's what I think of. And that's kind of really to Mo's point, right? Like when we talk about veganism and, Jains are vegetarian, many Jains have been going vegan, and that comes from, a deep compassion for other beings. And then when you think about like, hey, what does it mean to be radical with that in mind and grasp things at the root? It's like, okay, well, what are the conditions that these animals are in? Why are conditions that way? It's because there's companies that make money from having conditions that are really harmful because it's cheaper for them to put animals in these conditions. And then it leads you to these other questions of like, okay, well, who are the people who have to maintain these facilities and these labor workers who are in these really brutal conditions, but have to do that because they don't have other pathways to have like living wages, and even those wages are not living wages. And so it leads you to these other questions that I think are, the same questions that Mo was bringing up, but for me is like really grasping these things at the root. And then the second kind of thing that I was thinking about was Grace Lee Boggs, who is an activist that I've been learning a lot about, a revolutionary, and part of her story that I think has really stuck with me too, and her is because she is an Asian American, or she was an Asian American, came from a privileged background as I do, and found her way into radical social justice movements in deep relationship with the Black Liberation Movement. And she talks about revolution and, being around redefining our relationships with each other and to the earth and to the world, and to find the courage to love and care for people as we love and care for our own families. And in that, she's talking about Martin Luther King's idea of beloved community. And so I think for me, like, kind of these two pieces are like, how do we grasp things at their root, and how do we apply, what does that mean in today's world of radically applying nonviolence and non-attachment and non-greed? And then what does it mean to then be in completely fundamentally different relationship with each other and to the earth and to the world?
Thank you. And I think in a moment, I'll give you kind of a heads up. I'm going to ask all of you a little bit how this translates into your own work, whether at one project or resource generation or elsewhere. So kind of, because really, I think where you've dedicated your time bespeaks of your recognition and focus on the root, as you're saying, Anjali, as kind of these systemic issues. I'm also very much thinking, when we kind of had this introductory discussion about radicalism, I'm always thinking in my mind things like, wait, is it radical Jainism? Actually, it's more like Jain radicalism. And I talk about this a lot. It's right. It's more like a radicalism that you're committed to that's inflected by Jain values. But that might also in turn create a kind of radical Jainism in the world, because you're acting in ways that have been, say, fundamentally different, or interventions fundamentally different than have historically been done in Jain communities. It's interesting, you mentioned Angela Davis, who also kind of famously said, right, I'm no longer accepting the things I can't change. I'm changing the things I can't accept. And I think this is also a key component of radical politics, is that it's no longer accepting the environment and how to work within the environment. It's realizing that the environment in which someone lives is structurally deficient, discriminatory, unjust, oppressive, and hence, as Mo brought up, it is insufficient to simply live within that society, scroll your money away somewhere when the environment itself is doing oftentimes terrible things with it. So I think that's a nice segue into talking about kind of your work and how that relates to this. So I'll just go out of order. How about Mo, you want to start us off and kind of where your practice kind of you feel is vital, or at least is trying to be vital in this endeavor?
Yeah. I guess I'll also kind of incorporate a little bit of an introduction here. I grew up in New Jersey. Well, okay, I'm Mo. I use they, them pronouns. I grew up in New Jersey, on unceded Lenape land. That's the First Nations people that whose land I grew up on, and I moved to the Bay Area in California on Ohlone land for college, and basically from high school to college and beyond, I feel like philosophy, and particularly prompted by like hearing sadhus talk about Jain philosophy and what that means. And I feel like, I grew up hearing the sadhus in the Queen's Jain temple admonishing my community, my parents, my families, and that like New York is such a materialistic place. Like you're incentivized to be so egoistic. Like it's all about the brand names of the cars you drive and of the clothes you wear, and that like that's not what's important in this world. And I feel like I heard that kind of recurringly, and that was definitely one of my early sparks of like, okay, well, why do they think that? Or like, well, how did we get to this situation where, the Jain community I grew up in does feel like it's very attached to those kind of symbols of ego and materialism. But like many other communities, and yeah, so I went to law school. I studied philosophy in college, and I feel like my um, yeah, my curiosity has always been around um, like on the one hand, a lot of my work at the Sustainable Economies Law Center has a lot to do with wealth redistribution. We just hosted a webinar earlier this morning on wealth redistribution and the law that walked through a bunch of our new resources on this topic. And yeah, and so and what motivates me to do that work is just this clenching that I feel like is so pervasive in our society, to like hold on to the resources you have, the status you have, the privilege that you have. And because it's such a fear-driven, it's like the conditions of the world are scary if you don't have enough money to pay rent, if you don't have enough money to pay a health insurance bill. Like the consequences are so dire for a lot of people. And so the way that like US culture, American society, global systems of capitalism encourage that sort of hoarding, and how to support people as they, as Sahana talked about too, as they let go and feel the abundance of the world, like lean into the communities that will support them, and try to, instead of holding on to resources so that you can have housing, make sure that your whole community has housing. Like how can you be part of struggles for housing as a human right? And so that's also what I do with my land and housing justice work, is also just thinking about the enormous violence that happens to poor people in the society, that happens to people that don't have housing. And so I'll sometimes like go to different sweeps, like, or evictions that are happening of unhoused people, and I'll just be there as I'm not there. I can't like really change everything about their situation, but I can document the police misconduct that might be happening. I can provide them food. I can help them move their stuff. I can just basically be there, support, and so what paying attention to the actual conditions that so many people live in, whether it's like farm workers or healthcare workers or unhoused people that do, maybe they have a job and they still can't make rent because it's so expensive in San Francisco and the Bay Area. And yeah, so my work has a lot to do with housing as a human right, how we can restructure our housing system so that it's actually meeting people's needs and not just about greed, not just about making money off of the property that you own. And then yeah, and so my title is Wealth Redistribution and Land Justice Lawyer at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. It's a legal collective nonprofit in Oakland, California.
Great. And maybe Sahana?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take this opportunity to introduce my backstory a little bit and how I've ended up here. So I grew up in Arlington, Virginia, here on Piscataway land. I'm actually here right now, though I'm usually in New York. And I grew up rather disconnected from other Jain communities. I think I went to one Jaina convention when I was a kid, and honestly, I only have a vague memory of it, and was kind of ready to go home or bother my parents while we were there. So I think one thing I learned from Anjali and Mo's experience is what it was like to be part of Jain communities, grow up in the temple, grow up in the mandir, for example. But even though I didn't have that broader community, I did grow up with my nana and my dadi in particular being stewards of the religion. My nana is actually on this call right now, and my dadi passed just a few months ago. But they've really been the ones to carry forth the principles and beliefs and values of Jainism in our family, even in a changing world. And even after having been in the US for, I mean, many decades, my dadi since '68 and my Nana since the early '70s. So even through all that time, they've really kind of instilled some of the principles within us. But really the main one that I recall growing up with was around vegetarianism. I grew up vegetarian. My mom has kept us vegetarian, at least, until now. And I always understood the reasons for our vegetarianism to be that we believe in doing no harm to other living beings. And I was on board with that. I remained on board with that. And I started to even get into exploring food justice and the kind of animal rights movements and whatnot when I was in middle and high school. And then I really started to find my own political awakening, especially around the movement for Black lives and movements against police violence and brutality from 2012 to 2016 in particular. And so during that time, I wasn't in any way really actively thinking about Jainism, I would say. But perhaps it's always been kind of a lull in the background of my life, or at least from my grandparents, as that's all taken place. But because I grew up in this way, I think that really now I'm starting to think about how is Jainism influencing my practice, or how could it influence my practice more. So after going to college, I really delved into South Asian organizing and community organizing more broadly. And after a few years, found myself in the work of redistribution for the sake of social movements with resource generation and other organizations. And so as I've been in that space, I've been starting to think more about how does this work that I'm doing around repair, redistribution, connect to these Jain values around the redistribution of wealth to those who need it, around non-egoism, around non-materialism, for example. And I've started to have some deeper conversations with my family about it as well. So now I am in that work around reparations, redistribution, repair, and I'm excited to keep diving into the ways that Jainism influences it, and I'll chat more about that later.
Great, thanks so much. Anjali.
Cool. Yeah. I guess since we're doing little intros, I will share my little intro and answer your question. I'm calling right now. I grew up in Los Angeles, which is where I'm calling from right now. And I grew up in an upper middle class suburb. It's a diverse Asian American enclave. I'm Gujarati. I have two Gujarati parents who immigrated here in the 80s. I use she, her pronouns. And I say and share these things because I think it gives folks and a sense of the perspectives that I might hold and what colors those perspectives, and also a little bit insight into what I don't have firsthand experience of. And so I think, for me, as Sahana kind of mentioned, I grew up very, very involved in the Jain community. We'd go to Jain Center every other Sunday. My mom was super involved in the Jain community, is still really involved in the Jain community, and actually has started an organization called JCSC Connect that in some ways reminds me a lot of mutual aid, which is funny. But yeah, we've been very, very involved in the Jain community. And I think, when I was in Jain classes, we're learning so much different terminology. I don't know that I was really integrating it till later. And so I think similar was probably a backdrop in my life that I didn't realize was influencing me till I got older. And I think, when I was younger, it oriented me towards service work. And as I was exploring kind of different pathways of how I would want to spend my time as a working adult, I was drawn to health professions. And I think one of the challenges that I had actually was I was like, well, the kind of care that I want to be able to provide, I don't think I actually can do that in our current medical system. And I've had people close to me go through like experiences with the medical system that have been not great and terrible at moments. And I don't think I realized till I got older and started digging into more of these questions that, there isn't actually a perfect place out there, right? Like we're kind of constantly rebuilding a new world within the world that we're in right now. And eventually it led me to an organization called the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Philanthropy, where I was focusing on health equity work. And this is when I started, this coincided actually with a deeper spiritual journey and interrogating more questions around Jainism and how does Jain values apply to these values, as well as kind of getting more politicized. And, I was coming to the conclusion that many others have come to of like, actually, there's a bigger root cause here. Like the reason that this medical system is not working is because, well, the incentive is not people, it's not necessarily healing, it's actually to make money, and it's to make sure that pharmaceutical companies can make money. And that's the same thing that's true in pretty much every single sector. And so I was coming to this understanding of that there is this other root cause. And at the same time, I was like understanding about, okay, well, I got politicized over college, and then with in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, which is when I formed a collective called Jains for Justice, where we were doing some organizing around racial justice that I can talk more about. But that was kind of one of the moments where I was starting to think more about, okay, well, in Jainism, we talk a lot about ahimsa. That's been, I think, the primary principle is like that has been at the forefront. And I always hear Jains talk about when they're sharing Jainism with someone else who might not be Jain. And I was like, okay, well, nonviolence is also not something that I was in the inquiry of was, well, it's not just not avoiding violence, but it's also stopping violence when you see it happen. And it's also the presence of compassion. And so what does it look like? What do nonviolent systems look like? And I think that's when I started at that inquiry, really led me to thinking about when I was at Robert Johnson Foundation. I was starting to think, I was in philanthropy, where we're basically moving money to other organizations. And I think this was the same time that I started thinking as well about wealth redistribution, and also where does wealth come from? Like these large foundations, which folks may or may not be familiar with, but these large foundations have tons of assets, like a lot of money. And actually, then I found out that they're only by law, they only have to disperse 5% of their assets, which is a drop in the bucket, right? So it's like, and the rest of that 95%, as Mo said, can go into fueling fossil fuels and putting investments there, right? So it's like you're fueling, like pouring gasoline on the fire with one hand and then like having a water gun with the other hand. And so I started thinking more about wealth redistribution in that context of working philanthropy, and where does wealth come from? How do you, where are all the places that wealth has been hoarded? And then actually, like, it's when you talk about redistribution of wealth, it's redistribution back to where wealth has actually originated from. And I think that's like really important. And so when I came to one project, I was really thinking about, okay, well, like I have a better idea of like things that we don't want, but like, what do we want to build? And at one project where we're really focused on is in supporting organizations and building infrastructure for a new economy where the priority is not profit, but the priority is people and planet. And, I think it starts really simply with the idea that people who are closest to the challenges are closest to the solution. So when communities have the power to decide how to use shared resources to meet their needs, then people and planet can thrive, right? Like I'm going to be more interested and invested that my neighbors have clean water and that my neighbors have a place to rest their head than somebody who might own my property like 2,000 miles away. And so I think for me, part of where things have started to crystallize a little bit more has been around this principle of parasparo bagraho jivanam, like all life is bound together by interdependence, right? Like it's not just me helping out of the goodness of my heart or vice versa. It's because like my liberation or my sense, it's actually dependent on yours. Like we're in interdependence with each other, and it's a reciprocal relationship. And so I think that is what I see in like a different kind of economy where the incentives are different, that is really guided by interdependence with each other. And that's kind of where I've landed and where I am right now. Also continue to do grant making kind of work.
Wonderful. I'm going to exercise so much restraint and not going off on like a lot of different points of everything y'all mentioned, because I find it to be so resonant. And I think what you said at the end, Anjali, is really important of how much I think Jain values actually, this goes back to where we started, in a way that they're just so radical compared to typical industrial, racial, capitalistic values and systems, right? One of the most common things you may hear, right, in the U.S. from general public is like, who's going to pay for it, right? And the response is, well, like we are, it should be common sense. We are, and not only that, as you mentioned, it's not supererogatory, right? It's not above and beyond. It's actually either a form of reparations or just a form of proper action because we all are bound together, or we have these entangled liberatory struggles, however that is. So there's a way in which kind of these principles that you grow up with that not everyone grows up with. I did not grow up with these principles, are fundamentally different. And sadly, as someone who's non-Jain and grows up in this country, it often feels like what you learn as the values are these ones that you have to deconstruct later on, such as I have no moral responsibilities than to not commit harm to others directly. That almost seems to be this like common value, or the freedom to be left alone. It's this very much like individualistic, um, libertarian kind of ethos. And Jainism is just like fundamentally, at least let's just say in theory, kind of opposed to that on an ontological level, a philosophical level. But maybe in practice, it doesn't play out that way. So as I get to the next question, then is kind of seeing this disjuncture, I guess, like how would then you see this divide in how social justice is understood generally, generationally, say even with your family or peer groups? And to make it like a little spicier, I kind of really do want to ask, like, do you think the Jain community or Jain communities are in danger of kind of losing younger generations of people who are concerned with these issues, who are part of queer communities, who are part of kind of maybe anti-capitalistic communities or other kinds of organizing groups? Do you think there's actually kind of a large possibility of a break or a kind of rupture because of this difference? How about Mo? Why don't you start this time?
I'm gonna have to sit with that question for a minute longer, but I can kind of riff on some other threads. It's a great question considering my dad just joins the Zoom. I feel like my one through line that I also wanted to emphasize is just like how like important like meditation has been to me, and me like building just like a felt sense of safety, and like how like feeling interconnected with the beings around me, and that's, and I started meditating in 8th grade after going to the Jain temple where I assumed they were leading some stuff related to that, and now I'm doing a 10-day Vipassana meditation this summer, and I feel like that spiritual practice of being at peace with the world, and also like realizing how little you need to be happy. Like it's not that you need to go on some expensive vacation or have this really delicious expensive food or whatever else you might need to spend a lot of money on to feel at peace with the world or feel joy, and actually you can just like sit by a tree and be as happy as you can be. And that's like um and so I often kind of think of myself as on a trajectory towards like Jain monkhood of like I just want to cultivate silence and peace, and like, and then also like be part of letting go of ego, letting go of like material possessions that we're sold on. Like we're constantly being sold on, like you need this additional thing in order to live the life you want to live, to be happier, to be more convenient, to be more efficient. And yeah, and as far as like generational work, and also like thinking about Chris's question in the Q&A about like um successes of bringing like surfacing values of nonviolence and compassion in the Jain community. I mean, I think it's been just exciting to be in conversation with other Jain folks in, yeah, other young Jain people that grew up in the US that are also really thinking critically about what does a nonviolent economy mean? Like, what does a nonviolent approach to money mean in a society where some people have a huge amount of resources, most people have not that many, and most people don't really have their needs met. like I think half of the renters in California are cost burdened. There's a litany of statistics, but half of Americans don't have $400 for an unexpected expense as of a few years ago. There's just it's not just like some people have a lot, other people have not as much, but everyone's kind of fine. Like that's not really the situation at all. So we're in this society where the inequality leads to so much violence being done against like what is the violence of like a kid going hungry at night? Like, sure, there's no gun involved, there's no hitting involved, but there's a hungry child that goes to sleep without food. Like, how do we think of our role in our economic and social systems as trying to like get to the root cause of that issue? And so I feel like the work that I've been doing is to unlearn wealth hoarding. I mean, that's like basically what I feel like has been the most exciting work that I've been able to do in resource generation. So, Resource Generation is a national organization of young people with wealth privilege. Sahana worked there for a few years. And yeah, and I've organized several cohorts of other young South Asian people who want to become leaders in redistributing wealth, land, and power. And to me, that's like to the service of a more compassionate and nonviolent society. And especially because in order to get to a more nonviolent society, we need social movements, as Anjali was saying, to lead the way to better ways of living, to better ways of organizing food and housing and healthcare and labor and all of these structures that need to be rethought with the with nonviolence and compassion and equality for all life as at the core. And to me, I think that could be taken up more and more by Jain people. And it's been exciting to be learning from and learning with other Jain folks in these cohorts have helped lead of people that are reflecting on their own practices around money, their own practices around who they're giving to and how much the places that you're giving can actually get us to a more nonviolent society. Is it is it just a band-aid or is it actually something part of a movement that can actually create a lot of change in the world? Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add a quick note on that is that just by the way, I'm in contact with a lot of people in, say, farmed animal sanctuary movements, and they'll all say, we can't rescue ourselves out of the problem. It's actually not, and not even close to hitting the mark of the core issue. So just getting to your point of where maybe some money goes in all philanthropic communities, but also the Jain community, is it actually on the path to a certain horizon that you say it is? So how do you actually get on the path to that horizon point? Anjali.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be brief. But thank you for this question. I have like so many thoughts, so I'm gonna try to organize them. One thing that I'll just say to start with, to Mo's point, is like meeting Sahana and Mo has been so transformative for me in my heart. And I felt that when I've met other Jains too, who've been like thinking about these questions. And I've been really grateful for the generosity that like folks have showed in like at different points in my journey and helping me learn. And so I just want to say like there's people who are thinking about this, and if like anybody wants to chat, like I'll drop my email in the chat. And, like I'm down to kiki and talk about any of this stuff all the time. But the couple of things that I'll say to answer your question, I don't know if I'm in a position to say like, is there a risk of rupture or like schism in that way? I do know there's like some Jain institutions that, like, for example, Young Jains of America, that have like tried to kind of put some of these conversations forward as well. But I think there's like a couple of things that are challenging. I think one is I've actually been really inspired by seeing other communities take actions, whether that's going to protests or like having multiracial solidarities or build things that, and they make me think like, they might not be Jain, but I'm like, oh, that is what Karuna is, and that is what Seva is. And what they're doing is the way that I would really like to practice my Jain values. And so I think sometimes there's a challenge of, as Jains, there can be a lot of pride in our values and like as absolutely inform like the way that we walk. And there's like a lot that we can learn about how others have practiced values that we might have shared. And I think folks like, maybe in younger generations might be finding those communities that they're really resonating with that do practice those values in a ways that feel aligned outside of the Jain community. And so I think being able to have pathways to bring those learnings back into our community to help us figure out like how can we practice these same things, there is an opportunity in that. And I think there is an opportunity to cultivate more of an egolessness across our community in that as well. And then I think the other thing that is kind of, challenging is there's a lot of different, I've really benefited of just learning more, like for example, I was on the board of an org called the South Asian American Digital Archive. And I know Sahana's done some work with them as well. And Sada was just like exposed me to a whole history of South Asian organizing that I just didn't have any concept of, and all these stories around South Asian American history, like that I didn't really know about. Like, for example, when there were migrants coming to the United States, and you had South Asian migrants who were working on ships and jump ships and, were basically essentially refugees in New York and weren't able to get housing anywhere. And the boarding houses that opened themselves up to these men were run by Black women. And so there's like these histories of solidarities that I think are important for us to know about, like the fact that my parents immigrated here. I mentioned that in my intro. The reason that they were able to immigrate here because of the Immigration Act was directly because of the civil rights movement, right? And people gave their lives for that. And so there's these histories that we're not always aware of. And like, I think that leads to, there's a lot of like, pick yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. And like, we've really worked hard to get where we are. And that's not to negate any of the hard work that, folks have done. Like, people are working hard. Like, I like don't want to dismiss that at all. And there are advantages that we've had that put us into relationship with other communities in really deep ways that that put us into interdependence with other communities in really deep ways that sometimes we might not always know about. And so I think that is like another opportunity. And I think sometimes maybe younger generations might be a little bit more aware of that or exposed to that in different ways. And that can maybe cause some difference in understanding, and we need to like maybe find ways to bridge that gap. But those are some of the things. I mean, I can talk more about this, but I'm gonna try to keep it brief.
No, it's okay. This could be a 3 to 4 hour event, I think, if we had slowed down from the very beginning. But this is great. It's part of a conversation that ideally continues, and then through kind of, I don't want to say interest. I think interest sounds so cerebral sometimes, but when you're kind of like moved to feel like we can change. Okay, how can we do longer programming? How can we do classes? How can we do events? So this is great, though. Sahana, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I resonate with so much of what you've shared. And I think so my dada came to the US in 1949, so about 76 years ago now. So I think that in some ways I can have a little bit of that sense of what are we at risk of losing and what is at risk of changing over time with the Jain community as we move farther from being, in South Asia and India, and locating ourselves here in the US. So I took a little list for myself of like, we've lost a lot, that's for sure. There's some of the knowledge that is either lost or has not been translated fully to our generation. But here's what we still have. What we still have that I can remember is Namo Arihantaram, which is one of our pivotal core prayers. And that is something that my grandparents taught us to say from an early age, and something that I turn to in times of distress, probably not as often as my Nana would like, but that I do turn to, and I believe that my parents turn to as well. Meditation to some degree, little mandirs in our home and ways of honoring the Tirthankars and others who are in the Jain spiritual path. Some rituals. So, for example, when my dadi passed in December, we saw and attempted some of the rituals that are part of that process. So, for example, one of them is that I think about 13 days after passing, there is a prayer that you can do to facilitate the kind of freeing of the soul from this plane. That may not be the exact way to say it, but something to that effect. And we tried our best to recreate it on Zoom and find that moment to honor her wishes of a truly, as best as we can, Jain American kind of ritual and ceremony around her passing. But really one that also brought our family together at that time. Then I also think that we have some of the principles. So we've talked about many of them already, but some that I would stress are that all souls are created equal, and that this principle is one thing that we still hold in our family, and that, you know, even as some people, you know, experiment with non-vegetarianism, given the pressures of protein eating in 2025, many will still think about what does it mean that all souls are created equal, and how do we practice that even in this imperfect society we live in. And then another one that comes to mind that we haven't touched on too much yet is anti-untouchability and anti-caste values in particular. So one story that I always think of is one my dad told me. So back when he was a kid or maybe a teenager, he went to Palitana, our Jain holy site in India, and he was with some of his family members. And he was going, and I think he was about to grab some water. And somebody was about to hand him the water, and then someone else, another man, came in the way of this interaction and slapped the other one's hand, or shooed the other person away and said, don't touch him, you know not to touch him. And then my dad's aunt came into the interaction and said, we don't believe that, to the other guy. And this was precisely an example of my dad's aunt interrupting this practice of untouchability and articulating that we as Jains don't practice that way. So I think that this is another value that we need to hold on to tightly, practice, and look at what that means in the context of the diaspora as well. So these are some that I kind of see us still having and having to learn from. And the final one that I thought of was Michami Dukram. So one of the few kind of repetitive traditions that I saw in my family around Jainism was that every year, without fail, my dadi and my nana and even my parents would call and say Michami Dukram. And for those of you who don't know, this is around the time of Bajrushan, that we will call each other or talk with each other and say this. And I think roughly translated, it means basically, I ask for forgiveness for any harm that I have done to you, knowingly or unknowingly, and in this past year, for example. And so this like cycle of apology and of repair, of acknowledging the harms that you've done to folks unknowingly or knowingly, is something really special that I've been thinking about a lot more lately, especially as I move into work on reparations in particular. But I can touch on that later. But then on the other side of things, those are the things that we have. But I think some of the things that I see us needing would be community that is inclusive of everyone. Like I said, I've not been steeped in a Jain community or a Jain community of young people in my generation. So building out that community or finding the communities feels really important. Knowledge bearing and carrying forth knowledge is really important. So how do we make the knowledge of our ancestors accessible to all of us as we move on? I'm already nervous as my dadi's passed. What knowledge have I lost in not gathering everything? But thankfully I can still ask Nana, and we had a prep meeting before this session. And shared purpose also comes to me as the last thing that I feel like we need. And what does it look like to have a Jains for Justice or another type of formation that brings young Jains together around a shared purpose of fighting for equality, fighting for non-attachment, so on and so forth. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So looking at the time, so here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to get to a few of these questions, and I'm thinking that maybe like I could give one of the questions to each of you, as at least address it. And then a kind of general last question we might go over slightly is basically asking, like, what do you think, right, on the ground needs to be kind of changed and embraced, right? Is it, say, within the Jain community, more of this kind of enthusiasm towards advocacy, towards organizing, towards dedicating efforts and resources there specifically and getting involved, as Sahana said, for actually fighting for social justice, right? Not in this very like poetic term or this kind of like nebulous sense, but legitimately doing these things. So that's kind of an overarching question. I'm curious of where you think maybe most urgently or most possibly, I mean, those are two different questions, but you think or you would like to see that kind of intervention take place. But before we get there, so the first question was from someone who asked, what advice would you give to those of us struggling to be loving towards those who are motivated, towards people who are motivated by hate, division, and creating discourses of the dangerous other? So anyone want to volunteer for that one specifically? Okay, Mo.
Yeah, I was thinking about that one. I mean, I think Sahana and Anjali have talked a lot about compassion, about different all souls created equal, about different Jain values that I think are relevant here, including embracing multiple truths. I think maybe the thing that I would highlight is just that we live in a very violent and hateful society in many ways. And so the fact that people behave violently, embrace Nazism, which is like kind of ridiculous to say, but it's like back in full force right now. And so yeah, the fact that that happens um when like shame and people not having their needs met, when people don't know how to deal with harm except to like to cancel people, to cage people, yeah, to put people and animals in cages is like a widespread phenomenon that we have more people and animals in cages than any time in human history. And so like once that is such a primary logic of our society that people are afraid of whether they can eat the next day, whether they can pay their rent the next month, like when fear is that much at the basis of our society, like the fact that people lash out and turn to hateful ideologies, turn to misogynistic ideologies, to caste supremacist ideologies. Like these are all just like to hoarding ideologies. It's like I think it's all kind of to be expected, and to feel compassion towards those people and wishing them um, that they find the help that they need and the love that they need.
Thank you. Um, so another question asks, when we think about voting in elections and civic engagement as Jains, we know a lot of Jain principles are centered around intention. How do you view voting as a Jain-aligned intention of some good you see within a party or candidate, such as the lesser of two evils, when they also take part in things that are against the principles of Jainism or true progressivism? So I guess this would be a question about where do you think voting fits in? I mean, I just as a sidebar, I actually find that especially the American obsession with voting is kind of astounding and never ceases to amaze. But I'm kind of curious what you think about voting as a Jain, I guess, in Jain principles, but just voting in general as part of political praxis. Any volunteer? Anjali or Sahana specifically? Okay, Sahana, I'll choose you.
All right, I'll take it. Yeah, I think this is a good question. I mean, I view it as voting as one of the ways in which we are able to participate in our civil society, for example. And I think that participation in that for the sake of reduction of harm, if not for creating the world that we believe ought to be, that is aligned with Jain principles, is important. So I don't think that we can take a purist view to voting. We are under the systems that we currently have, which are rooted, like we've talked about, in systems of capitalism and systems of racial hierarchy, so on and so forth. We're not likely to get many perfect candidates, although look up Zoran Mamdani in New York and maybe you'll find one. But it's not perfect. But in any case, I think that it is kind of acts of harm reduction, and thinking voting is not, like you said, like there is this American obsession with voting because we view it as the singular act that we have to take control over our society, but it's not. It could be mutual aid. It could be solidarity economy projects. It could be, for example, here in DC, folks from Resource Generation and other movement spaces have together bought a building to create community housing, community spaces, and affordable housing. These are other examples of ways that we participate in the reshaping of our society, voting being one among them. So that's how I view it personally.
No, I think you raise a good point. I won't name any names, but there was also a large debate in kind of animal communities and animal rights communities. And people would say things like vegetarianism or veganism is like baseline. This is like your kind of ethical baseline. And a more controversial figure came along and said, no, that's actually not true. Activism is our baseline, or intervention is the baseline. And this caused like a bit of an uproar. And obviously it's a complicated issue, but I do find it to be an extremely vital conversation, because there's a way in which, right, voting, we feel like we've offloaded some kind of responsibility when it is clearly the easiest, simplest, least time consuming act. Or it's like attending one event once a year, a kind of march on one day, when we know from the history of social movements that that's not how social change happens from kind of one-off event. So I do find it to be an extremely important way in which this hyperfixation on voting seems to be intimately tied with a way to absolve oneself. And that might have even some kind of religious valence too, but that's for another day. Okay, so then there's one more question. Chris Miller's question, we kind of got to a little bit about the challenges, and so I'm not going to ask that directly. But there's one more question, Anjli. When it comes to wealth hoarding, how do you reconcile that with much of the immigrant wealth building mindset that many of us benefited from our parents subscribing to?
Yeah, thanks for this. I'll just say, like, and this is kind of actually connected to what Sahana and Mo was saying. I think at least my response to this. But one thing I'll also just say is, for all of this stuff, like, it's hard. It is hard. Like, that is just very true. And I think part of this is also just daily practices. And so I think when it comes to, the wealth hoarding, and there's a lot baked into here, right? Because like our relationships with money are so complex for so many reasons, because of the ideas of like the way that societally we've been conditioned to interact with money, our like trauma from money, if like folks have been in situations where they haven't had money and like haven't been able to meet their basic needs, right? Like there's so many different complexities, and people have really different relationships with money. It's also used as a form of control even within families. And so, I just want to name that and acknowledge that. And in terms of like all the things that come into play when you talk about health hoarding, I think a couple of the things that I think of is that one, to Sahana's point, is I don't think there is like a one way, like, to be purist about this. Like there's a spectrum of choices that you can make, and I definitely am on this journey myself. Like it could be like, I'm going to contribute to some of my wealth to like this organization that is building, like they're actually building a new kind of economic system, or they're actually giving out loans to businesses that are non-extractive, and I'm going to like distribute some of my resources into that. As like it could be like, I'm actually going to move some of my investments out of Wall Street. It could be like, oh, our family has a property, instead of like selling it, we're going to put it into a community land trust, right? There's a spectrum of different possibilities when it comes to what you choose to do with wealth. So that's like one thing. And I'm inviting myself, and like I'd hope that others feel invited to like explore what that spectrum of possibilities is, and to be able to find folks to be in community with around those questions. And then the second thing I think is also in terms, and then having conversations about like, what does your relationship money to mean? Where does it come from? Like, I think it's a really deeply personal conversation that if you can have with your family, like I would like want to continue having with my family. That's really important. Because it changes the decisions that you guys make together. And there might be different situations, right? Like if folks are supporting a family member, like that's a different financial need than, someone who doesn't necessarily have that responsibility. And then the last thing that I'll just maybe say to keep it brief is going to one of the points that Mo made around questioning what does wealth actually mean and what does building wealth actually mean. I think often we think about wealth in terms of money, and it is true, right, in our current economic system that it's like a primary way that we accumulate resources. And in a different kind of paradigm, wealth can be actually much more expansive, right? It's like our relationships that we have with our community. And so when you think about it in that way, I think a lot of immigrant wealth building, at least in my experience, has come from a place of wanting to have security and stability. And so shifting our ideas of where security and stability can come from, like if I feel confident that I have a community around me that will support me when I'm down, or I know that I feel confident that I'll have housing, or I feel confident that I'll be able to get food, like I don't actually need to accumulate wealth in the same way. Like I have a different source of wealth. And so I think part of what I think about in terms of shifting my wealth building mindset is, where am I now? What does wealth actually mean to me? And then how do I actually move toward building wealth in those ways, which might mean redistributing the wealth that I have now. So those are some of the things.
I think those are some excellent points. I really do think it, for better or for worse, really explodes into these larger conversations, right? What has happened to the kind of like racialized extermination of the extended family? What happens with nuclearization? What happens with individuation? How does that then require wealth hoarding? How does that require constant states of fear in which you kind of have to prepare for futures because systems aren't in place to support you, right? This is, I think they've talked about this earlier. There's a lot of fear involved. And I think Mo referred to this earlier. There's a lot of fear involved given that current system. But how can we start to engage in, say, organizing mutual aid systems, mutual aid programs, local security, so that there's no need to wealth hoard, right? Because you're hoarding you're not hoarding, but you're accumulating relations and networks, which is a different thing altogether. So we're a little past the hour, and I was going to pivot to the last question, but what I'm going to do in a moment is just ask you if you have a final kind of word or two you'd like to share before we sign off for today. But I do want to emphasize something that Anjli brought up, which is that yes, these things are hard, and also naming things isn't a calling out, right? These can be calling in, as they say. And also, I think there was something else you said that reminded me of what Nesar Gidave always says or writes about, this kind of tyranny of consistency, that we think that we want to make good choices. We get completely stifled by feeling like it's not perfect or it's not enough. But this is an incremental process. And we're also not individually responsible for all of the problems of the world ourselves. So I think that's kind of just a segue into, if there's something you'd like to end on today that is in this vein of kind of encouragement, or where you think that some efforts can be made, or what you'd like to say to the community, that's a way to call people in and kind of help along this path. Because even from our few questions, it seems like this is what people are interested in. So I'll start with Mo.
Yeah, thank you. This has been such an amazing conversation. I feel like the mantra I'm like gravitating towards right now is like open your heart. Just like let yourself be guided by love to more like and try to like an expanding circle of like people that you're motivated to help out when they're down. Like be in the practice of giving people money if they ask you for money and have no resources, like who you might see as homeless. And yeah, just to like be part of social change and be open to people and ideas that are brought to you, to people, things that you want to do, that you want to see in the world, and then you find somebody who's also thinking about the same thing, like go get it. Like yeah, just to be open and receptive to like the things that call you, that feel like they could actually get us to a more nonviolent and compassionate society.
Thank you. And Sahana?
Thank you. Yeah. So As I mentioned before, I'm shifting over to a organization that's focused on reparations specifically for the descendants of chattel slavery, so black folks who are the descendants of chattel slavery in the U.S. And the reason I bring that up is because the other day I was reflecting on some of their resources and the cycle of apology or the cycle of repair that they consider. And that cycle for them was reckoning, acknowledgement, accountability, and redress. And I asked my Nana the other day in preparation for this, Nana, how do you repair harm? When you've hurt somebody, how do you fix it? He says acceptance. First, you accept what you've done. Apology, you apologize or acknowledge what you've done. Correction, you take actions to correct that harm, but specifically based on the needs of the person you've harmed. So it's not just correcting it, it's correcting it based on the needs of the person you've harmed. And then finally, non-repetition. And he really stressed the importance of this. The reason I bring this up is because I think the proof is in the pudding, or the DNA of Jainism is one that tells us how to live in the societies that we are in, or tells us how to repair when things have been broken, repair when we have hurt each other. And so it doesn't tell us necessarily how to apply these practices, these principles and philosophies to the modern day, but it does tell us what to apply, if you will. So that was something that I really appreciated. And another example that I was thinking about for this conversation was that when I was talking to my Nana the other day, he told me for the first time, and I don't know how long we've been talking about my work around money and philanthropy and redistribution. He told me for the first time that he doesn't invest in arms manufacturing or killing animals. And that's an agreement that he has with his stock managers and finance managers, that he specifically doesn't do that. And he said, that's my religion. I don't do that. But the thing is that this is the first time I've ever heard of it. So I think what we have to do is push it to the next step of then we have to tell each other and talk to each other about the actions that we are taking in alignment with our faith, and organize at the very least those who share our values to take those actions. And I think a lot about the work Mo has done around embodied divestment and divestment from punitive carceral capitalist systems. So anyways, I just say that to say that I think we can remember that the DNA is in the faith in so many ways, and it's just up to us to interpret it, practice it, and strengthen our community around it.
Wonderful. And Anjli.
Yeah, Sahana and Mo gave such great party things. Maybe I'll just double down on what they said. I think I'll go back to what I said at the beginning about what Grace Lee Boggs, paraphrasing what she says about what revolution is about, which is redefining our relationships to one another. And to Mo's point, like open our hearts, broaden our sense of who is community. And I think part of that is in these moments where we feel like we're moving in ways that are not in alignment with our values. And, you know, to Sahana's point, like there's a reason, like we can have a sense of that, right? And I think there's those moments are moments to turn away, or they're moments to dig deeper. And I think the digging deeper is what we need to do, because that'll help us address like how can we practice those values in ways that feel congruent. And for me, it's certainly been true that as I've learned more and as others have taught me, as I've been going deeper in that journey, I've encountered new pathways to be part of and contribute to feel like what's really transformative change. And what that looks like will be different for every single person, whether that's like organizing or something else. So then the last thing I'll say is just doubling down on community. Like I've only encountered Jains who are like really interested in these conversations, I'd say in the last few years. I didn't before. And then I got connected to people in like older generations who were, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. But again, like I'm always available, like if you're trying to get connected or like navigate. And like I think I'm very interested in continuing these conversations as well. Oh, cool. Thanks, Sahana. I think Sahana's good job for email too. So yeah, I mean, the last thing I'll just say is that community who is interested in figuring out these questions and sharing with each other exists, and want to invite folks into that.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Let me just also add Mo's email to this list that I've been sending out. And I actually want to say it's extremely inspiring, not just to hear about your work, but even in kind of parting, and I know we're a little bit over, we'll end in a second, in kind of your parting comments about how this is like an individual process, an internal process to feel good about and feel connected. It's not just like go find your local chapter of XYZ and get involved because it's some kind of duty you need to do, kind of arm twisted, but mostly just kind of reflecting on the values of your own tradition and even maybe values that are outside of the tradition but still resonate with Jainism. I mean, this is often how I found my way to Jain traditions. And that itself will kind of guide you in certain directions and be open, as Mo said, to different ideas and see that they might already resonate with ways you feel about the world, but you're just kind of scared or unfamiliar. And it's new territory, new ways to think about your needs, wants, wealth, relationships. And I think that's just really inspiring to hear. And I just want to thank you for that really kind of sophisticated, kind of micro, macro way of not just analysis, but encouragement for folks. And I hope they really kind of take that to heart walking away from this podcast. So thank you all so much. I hope this is just the beginning of more conversations and more more talking and support and interventions in the future. So Mo, Anjli, Sahana, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. And for everyone out there, thank you for listening, for watching today, listening in the future. And we'll be back soon.